Howard Waitzkin tonight. Succinctly, he is one of the most prominent, original, and widely recognized individuals in the field of public health, social medicine, and the sociology of medicine. His brilliance and dedication were apparent from the time of his undergraduate career, and you're going to just have to suffer through this, Howard, at Harvard University. Being the first in his family to attend college, graduating summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa is simply an astounding achievement. That Dr. Waitzkin then completed a PhD in sociology under Talcott Parsons, which I'd love to hear more about. If you know something about that area in sociology, quite a feat. And also an MD from Harvard Medical School in 6 years is also remarkable. His scholarly stature is evident in his appointments at the University of California, Berkeley, Irvine, and Los Angeles, the University of New Mexico. He has many, many awards and fellowships, which I will not even list now. His work has been published in major journals in a wide range of fields, from The Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, to the American Journal of Public Health, to Social Science and Medicine, to the Monthly Review, and closer to home, Medical Anthropology Quarterly. It would be impossible to do justice to his work. I would just like to make two brief points. First, I know of no other scholar who can truly bridge what has often been called the micro-macro gap like Dr. Waitzkin. His training as both physician and sociologist has placed him in a leading role in the study of what people call doctor-patient interaction. Here he has gone beyond the relatively mechanical approach of researchers whose analytic frameworks are exhausted by conversational analysis and other fields to look critically at the factors that shape the very possibilities for these types of encounters. The broader structural and inequalities of health in the United States never slip out of his analysis. The politics of medical encounters continues to be, nearly 3 decades after its publication, a crucial tool for pushing beyond the body of not always too exciting literature, beyond biomedical subservience, beyond the goal of enhancing patient compliance, to transforming every interaction of his own clinical work over the period of nearly half a century into what I have referred to as communicative justice in health. Each of these encounters with a patient seems to provide him with an opportunity to critically theorize how capitalism, medicine, and health come together. Then, jumping scale, he has documented the effects of the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, and other international treaties and organizations in the ways in which they radically undermine public health. His work was published here, both in his book Medicine and Public Health at the End of Empire, but also in high-impact journals like the American Journal of Public Health. 2, much of my work in public health is conducted in Latin America, and as I travel to places like Brazil, Cuba, Ecuador, and Mexico, when I meet someone new, they always ask me the same question. ¿Usted conoce a Howard? Do you know Howard? Dr. Waitzkin is perhaps the most important bridge between the fields of critical epidemiology and social medicine in Latin America and research on medicine and public health in the United States. Our Latin American colleagues have been pioneering the theoretical empirical study of inequities of health for 3 decades and many more. Now that racial and other inequalities in health become topics for popular and policy-oriented discussions here in the United States, we need to overcome our own ignorance of the ignorance on the part of U.S.-based researchers and practitioners of this work. Dr. Waitzkin is the leading figure in this effort, and his work to be able to provide a portal that connects these bodies of work is very significant. His work is deeply critical and collaborative, as most recently demonstrated by Healthcare Under the Knife, Moving Beyond Capitalism for Our Health, which he wrote in collaboration with the Working Group on Health Beyond Capitalism, bringing together leading scholars and activists. It juxtaposes critical analysis of the progressive undermining of health care, health professionals, and public health in the United States, and the export of financialization globally, and brings this argument to a wide audience, scholarly and otherwise, endeavoring to contribute concretely to building the coalitions needed to effect real change. What a pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Howard Waitzkin.
I'm going to try to get this microphone to work.
It is turned on as much as it's going to be turned on. I'm sorry.
Okay, there's a little bit of sound. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
It works for Howard.
Okay. Here, you hold it.
Hang on. Otherwise, we'll drop it, and that will be the end
Let
of
me
the
just
mic.
begin by saying this is not a trivial problem for me, because I was going to announce that I lost my hearing in my right ear many years ago under dubious circumstances in Oaxaca during the total eclipse of the sun. And so I can't tell how loudly I'm talking. So please help me out. If you're having trouble, raise your hand. It's usually a problem of not loud enough, sometimes too loud. It's real hard for me to tell, so just please let me know. And that was a little much. It actually reminds me of a theme that I wanted to develop today, which has to do with inequality. So what actually motivated me to go into this whole area was my own family situation. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and my parents actually were office workers. Either part-time or full-time. They always had precarious jobs. So growing up, always felt like we were on the brink of disaster anytime. And I feel very lucky, because in my situation, a lot of my friends are, have been unemployed for most of their lives, and or died in Vietnam. So I feel very fortunate. But one of the reasons I wanted to express this, in addition to explaining that this is part of who I am and what motivates me to do stuff like this, is that when I hear stuff like Charles was saying, I feel like an imposter. And I did for many, many years feel that sense of alienation from these. They are facts. But I realized that for people from working class backgrounds and minority backgrounds, this is an almost universal feeling. And it's actually been studied, and there are a couple books about it, one of which is called Strangers in Paradise, and which is a study of working class people who have somehow made it to academia. And so I just wanted to mention that, because it's actually very relevant to the issues that I'll be talking about today. Are you still able to hear me okay? A little bit louder? Oh, does that mean okay? Okay. I just need to figure out how to advance this. So Charles said, it'd be okay to give a book talk, but actually you need to develop an argument. So I'm going to talk about this book, but I'm also going to combine it with something that I, with others, are working on now, which is considering the current and impending public health calamities that face us worldwide. Isn't it time to move the responsibility from them to us? And for this, I want to just give a deep acknowledgement to my very young 28-year-old colleague, Bradley Ridholm, who's one of the main organizers of a group of young people who are trying to transform the world, whose experience I actually will talk about toward the end of the talk. And I'm going to try to time this in a way that there's time for some discussion, because I actually would like to I'd welcome your feedback about this, because this is very much a work in progress. It's not a corner on the truth. And so, please feel free. If there's anything that's unclear as I'm talking, please let me know, and then hopefully we'll have a chance for discussion. We gave some of this at the American Public Health Association meetings, and I prepared the slide for that because it's required. So we participate in an organization called the Horizontal State Line Autonomous Region, which I had nothing to do with organizing, but Bradley was one of the key organizers. So we contribute and benefit financially in small ways to its efforts to build a solidarity economy outside capitalism. So that's my disclosure. Learning goals. I don't know, at Berkeley you might find this a little funky, but I often have to do this, and these actually are the goals. So to analyze from a critical public health perspective why it's necessary to move beyond capitalism for our health. To consider the distinction between we and they in our efforts. To explain components of the, quote, conscious little push, citing the great political economist Ernest Mandel, required to move beyond the global capitalist system. And to discuss several case studies of organizations here in this country and in other countries that include health services and public health interventions within a post-capitalist, what's called solidarity economy. Okay? Any objections? Okay. Okay, so here's what I want to say to begin. So this is one view of capitalism. So here's capitalism up here, and it causes basically all our problems. So, poverty, inequality, food insecurity, housing insecurity, racism, sexism, ageism, and other isms based on socially constructed differences, militarism, endless war, gun violence, arms trade, military-industrial complex, environmental degradation, expropriation, pollution, climate change, species extinction, ideology, hegemony, distorted education, ill health, and this is the part that's most relevant here, mental illness and suffering, drug use, leading in the United States to now the deterioration of our life expectancy through opiate use and the suicide epidemic among people 55 to 65 in particular, who suffer from what's been called in public health hopelessness. Barriers to accessible services, the medical industrial complex. Incarceration, prison industrial complex. Neoliberalism, austerity, privatization, philanthropy, capitalism. And here is resistance, struggle, and political action. So this is what I and many other people do most of the time to deal with these problems. And I'm calling this peculiar ways of struggling to improve our key problems without confronting capitalism. Because what we generally do is to struggle in various ways, individually and in groups and in organizations, to deal with these effects of the cause instead of dealing with the cause. Pretty peculiar. And so this effort, this book, is actually an attempt to understand this better and then to move ahead. And this is the book. If any of you want, I know there's some copies here, but if you want to obtain it, I recommend the website of the publisher, Monthly Review Press, where it will do the most good, actually. And the National Nurses United, which Chris is here, and there may be others, which organized the event and co-sponsors this event, actually did some fundraising around this, and groups around the country have done that. Monthly Review gives a cheap price, a relatively cheap price, and then organizations can use it for fundraising. This is a book that's actually hopefully coming out next year that I wanted to just mention, called Social Medicine and the Coming Transformation, which is actually a critical text you're asked to prepare about social medicine. I think it's relevant to the Institute. I'm going to go further here. And I want to just acknowledge my colleagues, Matt Anderson at Montefiore in New York, and especially Alina Perez, Juanez, who was actually a medical student in Illinois, where I hang out most of the time now, at the University of Illinois. And she collaborated as kind of a voluntary research assistant and did such an amazing job that she's actually a co-author, and I just want to acknowledge that. So I've talked about my hearing, and I'm interested, if we have time and you want to hear your stories, because almost everybody has a story about healthcare in the United States. And welcome your constructive criticism and feedback. So my history, as I mentioned, my parents held precarious jobs, and actually at age 55 my dad was fired after 25 years with this medium-small business producing chrysanthemums. And this was a tremendous event, unemployment, as it is for almost everybody who becomes unemployed, but especially for people who are on the brink of poverty. And what happened was they, tried to get an appointment with their doctor of many years, who said, "No, I can't take care of you anymore without insurance." So this is what's called abandonment, which is actually considered unethical by the American Medical Association. So later, I actually contacted the AMA and was told that the restriction on abandonment actually applies to every situation except loss of insurance. So that's okay in the United States. So what they had to do was actually revise their whole pattern of medical care. And about 2 months after my dad lost his job, he actually passed out and was taken to the county hospital. This was actually in Salinas, where their company had opened a small subsidiary. So they were taken to Natividad Medical Center in Salinas, and he was admitted and treated by residents who didn't have supervision, because that was the norm at that time. And so it turned out he was bleeding from a duodenal ulcer. So he got transfusions, eventually improved, was discharged. But at great cost, not financial cost, but the cost having to do with dignity. And then a month after that, my mom fell, suffered a Hawley's fracture in the forearm, and went to Natividad also, where the residents operated on her and kind of botched the job. So she lived the rest of her life with a deformity of her forearm. So I'm kind of into this topic. And it's even affected me, because as it may have affected some of you. So earlier than that, believe it or not, I was a baseball champion, and in Little League, and most valuable player and home run champ and all that. And then I stopped growing, right, at 12. So it was all downhill from there in baseball. And so in Pony League, when I was 13, I slid into third base, and my cleat caught under the base and broke my leg. And I sat on the bench. It was just in the first inning. And so for the rest of the game, I sat on the bench in agony. And eventually the coach took me to the hospital, where a fracture of the tibia and fibula was diagnosed. Pretty serious. So I was in a cast up to my groin for 3 months when I was 13, and eventually improved and went back to playing baseball, actually. But when I was 30, when I was a senior resident, actually, in internal medicine, I developed excruciating sudden pain in my shoulder and neck, and actually lost strength in my arm. I couldn't raise my arm. It turned out that I had slipped a disc in my neck that was impinging on the nerve. Why? because my right leg that had been fractured actually grew back about 1.5 inches shorter than my left leg. So now I wear a lift and all. I'm saying that just because the reason that happened was that we didn't have insurance and couldn't afford follow-up for my broken leg at the time. So these are very personal issues, and it was out of that that I actually decided to try to spend a good part of my life trying to do something about these problems, not too successfully. So let me just say that was actually, believe it or not, the origin of this book. And I want to acknowledge my comrades and colleagues in the working group on Health Beyond Capitalism, because what happened is we realized that after we developed the first single-payer national health program proposal. It was published in the New England Journal in 1989. So, I have the advantage of being on the planet a while, and so that proposal, slightly modified, is still in Congress. It was immediately introduced in Congress, and all that time later is still in Congress in a slightly modified form. It's the proposal in the Senate of Bernie Sanders and now multiple other senator colleagues, and about 120 or 130 representatives in the House of Representatives. So here's a comprehensive single-payer proposal modeled off the Canadian system that was published in supposedly the most competitive medical journal, and is a pretty good article, and has zero chance of passage. Zero. In fact, maybe less than zero, because the co-sponsors of it are highly subject to the whims of our political system. So we don't know if they're actually going to stay involved. But I do want to just acknowledge this group, because we got together realizing that we couldn't just continue to argue for a single-payer national health program anymore. It just wasn't happening. So we had to study this to figure out why that is and where to go from here. So this whole effort developed from that realization. Despite more than 30 years of effort, because we had been working on this for several years before that publication, this wasn't going anywhere. Okay? So this effort came out of that realization, self-criticism. And I also just want to acknowledge these people at Monthly Review who did a fabulous job of supporting and offering editorial suggestions. And the book is dedicated to Asa Cristina Laurel and Vicente Navarro, two of our inspirations in social medicine. And I just wanted to mention that as of Saturday, the 1st of December, Asa Cristina Laurel, who is one of the leaders of Latin American social medicine, amazing person, as are multiple other people, as Charles mentioned, is the Subsecretary of Health in the government of President Lopez Obrador in Mexico, that just took power on Saturday. And in Mexico City, years ago, they actually developed a parallel health system that actually has provided access to much of the population beyond the initial expectations. And they finance it basically by cutting out corruption. And this is the plan for all of Mexico, to initiate what amounts to a single-payer national health program in Mexico. I won't spend more time on that, except to acknowledge that this is part of a worldwide set of issues, and that people are struggling with. And so the book, actually, after a lot of thought and work, names capitalism as a central problem in healthcare and health, which is a step, and names revolution as the solution to this problem. And the challenge here is, what does that mean now? What does revolutionary change actually mean in relation to healthcare and in general, in the current context? So this book actually tackles that problem. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So this basically describes the 30 years since our single-payer proposal. And we reached the insight that this has been blocked by the inherent characteristics of global capitalism and a very tiny group of elites who actually control power and finance worldwide. And just to give one of many examples of this, of the global inequality that exists, the famous 99%, 1% division. It's actually closer to 99.7% and 0.3% of the distribution of wealth and power worldwide. And in the United States, as of a couple months ago, there are actually 3 men who hold the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the U.S. population. And worldwide, the ratio is even worse. So that's what we're facing. It's not a lot of people, but they're pretty powerful. We also have realized that we've been modeling our efforts off the positive models of effective national health programs in other capitalist countries, like Canada, which was a model of the single-payer proposal, the UK, Scandinavia, which is a national health system proposal, in which there's basically the whole health sector is in the public sector, as opposed to just the finance system in the public sector, which is the case in single-payer systems like Canada. All of those systems, every one of them, in the last 10 years, has been under attack with major privatizations, neoliberal policies with austerity, cutbacks of public service, and especially the entrance of finance capital, because these national health programs are one of the last frontiers for capital accumulation. A very sad story, which makes us very humble in the United States, because we can't even take the models of the other capitalist countries that have national health programs as models for our work to improve access in the United States. So this is a little figure that I just wanted to show you because you might find it amusing. So fundamental contradictions in national health programs established within capitalist states. So here's capitalism, and here's the capitalist state, which Marx and Engels described as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. What does that mean? Well, it means that the main function of the capitalist state is to protect capitalism. That's what our government does, in essence. To do that, it also does a number of welfare functions, like provide health care, like provide police departments, like provide fire departments, and so forth, public education, etc. And those services actually, according to this model, are great, but they actually wind up reinforcing the same system. And they're subject to cutbacks at the first financial crisis of the capitalist system. And so in healthcare, we don't need to look farther than 10 years ago, in 2008, 2009, which has been called in the United States socialism for the rich, which basically was the public sector taking over every failing capitalist enterprise, from banking to the auto industry, etc., and supporting it through our tax money out of our pockets, leading to a situation of the preservation of the capitalist system in the United States. Otherwise, it was on the brink of collapse. And that's what it is now, still, on the brink of collapse. So this is not a strong system that we're fighting. Predictably, next year or the year after, it'll be even worse than it was in 2008. Because this is an inherent characteristic of capitalism and capitalist system, to go from crisis to crisis with public bailouts every once in a while. So regarding a national health system, including single payer, what happens is, even if successfully established, as in Europe, they're always subject to cutbacks and privatizations during the crises of capitalism. So this is the fundamental issue that this book tries to address. And it's a crucial moment in history that we're living in now. And my argument is that it's important to actually stop and notice that. This is like an important time in history that we're living in right now. We have tremendous dangers: fascism, climate change, predicting that Wall Street will be underwater in 20 years. I mean, it's pretty heavy to think about, isn't it? And nuclear war, of course, the risk increasing day by day in the current circumstances. But we're also seeing now the most widespread global politicization, mobilization, and resistance in history. I thought something was going about this, during the 60s and 70s, but this is way beyond that. And it's actually the youngest generation that's at the heart of this. People like Bradley, I mentioned, who's 28, who have realized that even though they're extremely smart, people like you, a lot of you in this room, very smart, young, tremendous potential, going deeper and deeper into debt, anticipating jobs that previously offered some professional autonomy, but now are basically under the control of the corporate system in the United States and elsewhere, entering that situation with big loans that then lead to a condition of subserviency, trying to pay off the loans, and the loss of idealism. So this is what we're facing now, and so there's tremendous enthusiasm now among young people, and I'm sure this includes some people in this room, to try to do something about this. And so this is actually a big source of hope. And many of us in our group realized that we had to understand more clearly the linkages among the health services, health itself, which is not the same thing, and the global capitalist system, and then to develop and act on strategies and struggle that clearly address the links among capitalism, health, and health services. And we did it as a collaboration because none of us felt that we could do it as individuals or even smaller groups. So I just wanted to cite the great literary critic, Frederick James. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of our economic system. Is that clear? We can think about global warming, flooding, nuclear war, destroying the planet, etc. All these scenarios that would be the end of civilization. But to imagine an end of capitalism, now that's a challenge, right? What else is there? And so, nevertheless, that's what we have to do at this point in history. And this is not a hopeless cause, actually. It's actually a very doable task, is what I'm going to argue. And so the book, I'm just going to summarize the parts of this book very quickly. We're actually very proud of this collective effort. So the first part deals with social class and medical work. And this has to do with the proletarianization, the deteriorating class position of professionals, so that people like me, people like current medical students and residents, people who are in the profession increasingly lose control over our own ability to produce medical services as medical care is increasingly corporatized and we become employees of large corporations. They're usually for-profit corporations. So that's what this part of the book addresses. And what happens is that our professionalism in health services and our high salaries actually mystify the loss of control over the means of production in healthcare. And the effects of that, the bad effects of that on practitioners of medicine are tremendous. And this is what I and others deal with day in and day out. So that currently, because of the conditions of our work in medicine, half of practicing doctors report being burned out. And actually, there's one suicide a day among doctors, one a day, which is equal to the suicide rate among active duty military personnel, for many of the same reasons, actually. And so what's happened then is a degradation of medical labor in addition to that. And this concerns the electronic record, which is basically a corporate instrument designed for collections, not designed for clinical services, but that we have to deal with day in and day out. And administrative control by basically representatives of large and increasingly small number of health care organizations, so that practitioners feel we've lost control over our ability to deliver humane health services in medical care. So the next chapter, the next part of the book talks about the medical industrial complex in the age of financialization. So the medical industrial complex has actually existed for a long time, and there's been a lot that's written about it. And the change here is that production has become increasingly monopolized. So there are fewer and fewer large corporations that are working in the healthcare sector, and there's more and more financialization. What does that mean? So this has to do with what's been termed the FIRE industry. I'm sure many people have heard of that, which refers to finance, insurance, and real estate, which is an overlapping group of enterprises that now control the healthcare sector. And, it's been considered parasitic. It doesn't involve any productive activity, actually. And this involves the financial and insurance industries that have now become actually indistinguishable. So that the investment experience, we used to think that it was how sick employees are and their healthcare utilization experience that determined what we pay for health services by premium. Actually, that's no longer true. What actually determines our healthcare expenditures are the investment successes or failures of these corporations in the world, in the global financial marketplace. And so this is a big change in economic realities, and it has a huge impact on our ability to understand and actually to change the financial structures of the medical system. And so this part of the book deals with those changes. The next part deals with the pharmaceutical industry, talking about such issues as changes in the medications that are profitable to a smaller and smaller number of medications, control over pricing through intellectual property and patents and barriers to access, and corruption regulation. And again, I'm reviewing this very quickly. The book actually, I and my colleagues go into a lot of depth about each of these topics. So the next is about neoliberalism and health reform. The first part is a chapter by me and my colleague Ida Hellender on Obamacare, which actually shows that Obamacare is a product of the World Bank. And the same basic structure as Obamacare was actually thought out and then proposed by basically economists at the World Bank. And it was first implemented in Colombia in 1994. That was actually, and it's still going in Colombia. And that was the same year as the Clinton healthcare proposal, which went down. But the Clinton proposal was basically the same proposal as the Colombia plan, it turns out. And subsequently, that model has been come up again and again. It was the model that Mitt Romney proposed in Massachusetts when he was governor, and it's the same model that Obamacare is based on. And in this chapter, we actually project the structure of the Colombian healthcare system and Obamacare. See, it's exactly the same structure, the same use of co-payments and deductibles and so forth. And the key thing is that what Obamacare does and what this model does, this neoliberal model of health reform, is that it takes health services, pays for it publicly through our tax dollars, and moves the whole administration and profit-making from this into the private insurance sector. So we have elements like Medicaid managed care, the control of Medicare, et cetera, basically run by for-profit corporations. And a lot of the problems of healthcare access that we have now have to do with this basically movement of public money from our pockets through our taxes into the private insurance industry. The next chapter deals with austerity, and this has to do with how the European national health programs that we've so admired as models of how accessible health services can be brought about in capitalist countries are basically being dismantled one by one as they are being taken over by private corporations, especially in countries like the United Kingdom, where the Minister of Health was actually previously the vice president of one of the US-based for-profit insurance companies, but also in other countries like Holland, increasingly in Sweden and other countries. And this is already having very adverse effects on health. So the models of capitalist countries that we used to view as what we're aiming for in the United States are basically getting dismantled because of the same forces of global capitalism that we're confronting here. The next section of the book deals with imperialism's health component. So this is an attempt to situate medical care in the United States within a global context. And so we deal with the philanthropies, international financial institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and trade agreements like NAFTA and other trade agreements as a key element of what has happened to health services worldwide, and then the effects within the United States of this. And then the next chapter is about philanthrocapitalism, which is a really amazing chapter that shows how the biggest philanthropies, like the Gates Foundation, previously the Rockefeller Foundation, have now become the main mediators of health services worldwide. The World Health Organization is actually financed mostly now by the World Bank and the Gates Foundation rather than participating countries. And this is a tremendous change that influences the way health services are actually organized, focusing on vertical measures around particular profitable diseases, especially infectious diseases like AIDS, rather than horizontal systems that improve access to health services more globally. And then the last part of the book is the road ahead. So one of these is resisting the imperial order. So this is a chapter by Rebecca Hassel-Aguilar, my colleague, former graduate student, and I, about 3 countries in Latin America, Bolivia, El Salvador, and Mexico. And we show how the struggles in those countries against the neoliberal model have actually produced remarkable improvements in Bolivia around access to water supplies, which is a key element of public health, which are going to be privatized by Bechtel Corporation based in San Francisco, and through a massive resistance to that, is now back in the public sector. We talk extensively about the situation in Mexico that I mentioned earlier as part of that chapter. Is that intentional?
Somebody accidentally leaned on the light switch, I think.
Is it by the door?
Yeah.
It times us out.
Really?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. At some point, you will make a gesture that will make it magically come back on.
Okay.
Bechtel's manager.
And then the next is a revision of the single payer proposal, which is actually a version of the proposal that's now in Congress, sponsored by Bernie Sanders in the Senate and by various congresspeople in the House, which is analyzed in detail in that chapter. The next chapter is on mental health, a very important chapter that talks about overcoming pathological normalcy. What this means is it refers actually to a concept that was developed by Eric Fromm about how adjustment to our more or less insane society is viewed as what's mentally healthy. Adjustment to the various problems that I talked about earlier, and that what's viewed as mental illness is a small group of people at the fringe. But what this argues is actually that pathological normalcy is a problem, and proposes that has to be dealt with, no longer considered normal. The next part deals with social and environmental determinants, basically having to do with poverty, inequality, racism, and environment. Maybe you could turn off one of them.
Charles, can you turn off the front one?
Just turn off the front. And this includes climate change, loss of habitat, industrial agriculture, and global epidemics like Ebola, Zika, and influenza. This is actually a really important chapter that has to do with the ways in which our health processes and outcomes are increasingly determined by global processes under capitalism. And then the last chapter talks about the road ahead, which is which actually is a hopeful part, moving beyond capitalism for our health. And these are specific struggles that address the linkages among capitalism, health, and health services, dealing with political realities, in particular the failure of electoral democracy. And so, just one of among many examples is that when Donald Trump, quote, won, unquote, the 2016 election with 16% of the vote in terms of eligible voters, and even in the votes that were cast, a minority of the popular vote. Tremendous implications of that. I and some other did a very not too deep survey of history, the history of democracy going back to Athens. And we're trying to come up with a single election that actually achieved something positive. We couldn't find one. I'm sure there are some, but it's not the common pattern. The common pattern is not achieving major change through election. And that's how it's been actually since the development of what's called democracy. So this chapter actually talks about that and what can be done about that. This chapter also talks about health workers, including nurses and doctors, in social movements as a key element of change. And it focuses on the development of communal health organizations, and we actually consider several examples from Latin America and elsewhere that involve linking health services to changes in the governance structure, moving toward communal governance. And we use Venezuela, which has some very positive and also some negative aspects, as an example of a struggle that consciously is trying to do that. And then political change, the problems of our two-party systems, the twin inequalities, which have to do with income and wealth on the one hand, and health on the other, very much in parallel in our societies. And then the achievement of dual power. And what that refers to is that the road ahead in terms of positive social change, what I talked about, revolution, in terms of revolution, actually more and more involves the achievement of dual powers. So what that means is the achievement of of elected power at the local level, in particular for cities and counties. And within those counties, the achievement of community-based power that's not based on elections. And that's a movement that we're actually seeing worldwide now, that is a transition from what we refer to as electoral democracy, which generally leads to the conditions we have, as the great nurse and anarchist Emma Goldman said. She said, if elections accomplished something, actually, they would have been illegal long ago. And so with that realization, a much more focused view of the potentialities of election, and the realization we no longer need to be wasting our time on electoral struggles that actually don't change anything. Okay? So that's what this part of the chapter deals with in terms of talking about roots of change. Now, in the remaining time, I want to see, what time is it?
6:30.
Okay. So in the remaining few minutes, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about this issue of who are they, who are we, and Jameson's comment that I mentioned earlier, that this is our task. What this conveys is actually a vacuum of creative thinking that continues to hinder the path of the movement beyond global capitalism. That each year this system benefits an increasingly smaller part of the world's population, around 0.5%, at the expense of the rest of us. And the question, though, is how to move from A to B, right? How to move from capitalism to something beyond capitalism. And this is a question that actually we have to answer. And that I don't have the full answer, but I do have some ideas that I'd like to present on behalf of our working group. What we have now is a crucial period of history when the destructive forces of the capital system actually threaten the survival of humanity and other forms of life. Now, in the present. And I used to feel, well, I'm doing the best I can, but I may not live to see it. And I actually don't feel that's a justifiable position anymore, because the problems that we're facing now are so acute and so devastating worldwide, and the opportunities are so profound now in terms of popular struggles that are mobilizing huge parts of the world's population. Although because of the mass media, we're often unaware of one country to another of these struggles, or even in parts of countries like the United States. So our current historical period contains tremendous dangers: nuclear war, global warming, as I said, fascism, a world based on the deepening exploitation of nature, inequality, repression, and suffering. And we also have unprecedented global resistance. Just for instance, on the day after the inauguration, I'm sure you remember, there was the biggest mobilization of political activism through the Women's March and the related participation worldwide that the world has seen in history on that day, with police permits. And so that's the question that we're asking here. And so we've seen now, then and later, unprecedented global resistance and social movements that seek to create a world based on harmony with nature, relations of mutual cooperation, and decision-making by ordinary people about the directions that our societies will take. And for that reason, revolutionary strategy has to involve what we're calling rinky-dink, which may be the wrong word, but I think you get the drift. Rinky-dink actions and inactions that are easy and predictably secure, at least for the most part. These actions are mundane, unglamorous, but also feasible within the life of each of us. And that's the scenario that I and our group are arguing we all need to be paying attention to and making decisions in our own lives to move ahead on this front. So, who are we and who are they? The present also contains unprecedented global resistance and social movements that seek to create a world based on harmony with nature, mutual cooperation, decision-making by ordinary people about the directions that our societies will take. And so this is the dialectic struggle, the struggle of doomsday versus a huge part of the world's population, increasing every minute, that's struggling to create a better world. And what we're arguing is that we need to start thinking about this in our day-to-day lives much more explicitly and to direct our behavior accordingly. So for that reason, revolutionary strategy now has to involve rinky-dink actions and inactions that are easy and predictably secure, at least for the most part. And these actions are mundane, unglamorous, but feasible within the life of each person. The old categories of revolution, electoral democracy, working class, left party, revolutionary vanguard, violent takeover of the state, etc., will not work in this period of history and may actually never have worked. So what we need to do is to move creatively toward a new way of communicating and of making revolution that's different from the old models. So who are they, who are we? So they represent less than 1% of the world population that benefit from global capitalism, that do not recognize its adverse effects and resist change. We are the millions who want post-capitalist society that does not destroy Mother Earth, humanity, and other life forms. We are the main financiers of the capitalist system through our consent to the current system, that's citing Antonio Gramsci, and through our financial decisions, through our taxes, half of which in the United States go to the military, half. Through our investments, our little savings accounts, our retirement accounts, our mortgages, our credit card purchases, etc. And as I said, our purchases through credit cards and the internet and other ways of spending money. Now I want to just refer to John Holloway. He's a great social philosopher from Ireland, initially based in Mexico, who goes more about this in terms of who are we, who are they. We are dignity and dignified rage, citing the Zapatistas in Mexico. We are wealth. It's our wealth, actually. That's why we rebel. We are self-contradictory and confused. We do not fit. We actually don't fit in a capitalist society. Although we try to, we actually don't. We overflow our identities. We're verbs. We're doers against capitalist work. Oh, please, let me have my alienating job. And this model is to rethink and redo what we've historically accepted as work under capitalism. We're the crisis of capitalism, and we're proud of it. That's John Holloway's words. So we no longer accept being dominated by the rich and powerful, knowing that they can dominate us only if we give our consent to it. Give our consent to it. We no longer accept the dominant hegemonic ideology that shapes our false consciousness, encouraging us to think, first of all, that capitalism serves most people well, which it doesn't. That our elected leaders will produce the changes in politics that will protect and take care of us, which they don't. And, quote, there is no alternative, unquote. Tina. There is no alternative to our current political economic system. These are the problems. And this is a statement from our group in Podockville, Mid-America, in north central Illinois. These aren't my words. These are the words of Bradley Whittle, my colleague, who's 28. And they invited 5 of us over 30 to join the group about a year and a half ago. But actually, the vast majority of the group are 23 and under. And I was shocked to find out that this is happening like everywhere. Very surprising in that part of the United States. This is their words. We are the termites that advance the decaying bourgeois institutions. And we are the builders that will build new ones from grassroots people power. Trying to construct a solidarity economy. And so the realization is that capitalism actually is weak. It's constantly on the brink of disaster, as I was saying earlier, in terms of what happened in 2008. And it's we, the people, who continue to bail it out. And there are 2 main sources of capital accumulation currently. And you actually only have to study economics that's not necessarily what is taught in economics departments, but economics that is oriented toward a more critical condition to understand very clearly that at the current time, there are actually 2 main sources of capital accumulation in the world. One is endless war, which the United States is doing, obviously, which has been referred to by Naomi Klein and others as disaster capitalism, creating wars and then reconstructing, picking world wars and reconstructing and so on. And then the other way, capital accumulation, is through fiction, not corresponding to any productive economic activity. And so this is actually the best way to make zillions of dollars if you're a capitalist, is to create fictional financial instruments, derivatives, grouping of loans together, et cetera, which don't actually exist in any reality, but are financial instruments that then are sold at a price. And this is actually how the majority of wealth in the world is now generated, through the creation of fiction. That may sound a little far-fetched, but it actually is the case when you look into it. So the crises of capitalism have actually become so profound, as Ernest Mandel said, that it's condemned to die sooner or later. But it will always be necessary to give it a conscious little push. And it is our job to do the pushing. And the question is, how to do that? So the strategy of the conscious little push aims at the contradictions where capitalism is actually the most vulnerable. Right? John Harley calls the cracks of capitalism. And so, the conscious little push requires us to clarify what specific characteristics of capitalism are oppressive and need to go. And these involve the exploitation of human beings, animals, and nature. Because we're really at the end of the road as far as exploitation, especially in nature. The extraction of surplus value, a Marxist concept that is actually the inherent structural basis of exploitation under capitalism. The creation of value through work that capitalists enjoy and workers don't. And also the requirement for economic growth, leading to the recurrent crises of overproduction, underemployment, famine and abundance, and environmental devastation that we see. Overthrowing racism and sexism, which are the ways that a lot of the economic exploitation gets masked. I can go on about that. Through overcoming imperialism and overcoming militarism, endless war, the arms trade, and gun violence. So those are the things that have to go. And it's important to try to understand what has to go. And that's what has to go. And then the conscious little push also requires us to clarify what non-oppressive characteristics are and do not have to disappear. And these involve a lot of private property, for instance, homes, gardens, ecological cars, personal possessions. These aren't the essence of capitalism. The essence of capitalism is what I said earlier, surplus value, the holding of value by a small group of people who actually don't do the work. And that does not imply the exploitation of living beings or nature, that does not promote extraction of surplus value from the work of others due to ownership of the means of production, and the building of small, non-exploitative businesses, co-ops, credit unions, etc., that don't involve the generation of surplus value. So, remember that earlier slide I showed where capitalism is generating all these problems and we're fighting the problems at the bottom. So this is another way to view that in terms of, instead of working on each problem, to actually work on ways to address capitalism as a system. And this involves the rinky-dink revolution, struggling to improve our key problems by confronting them from beyond capitalism. And they involve creative destructive actions and creative constructive actions. And to end, I just wanted to summarize that. So this is just a reorientation of that earlier drawing that I did that moves the bottom boxes up and enlarges them. So creative destructive actions. So this involves resistance and non-participation in the global capitalist economic system. Focus, as Holloway has put it, on the cracks in capitalism, on its contradictions, on its vulnerabilities. This involves direct actions that specifically aim to slow down and to stop the easy functioning of capitalism, to avoid symbolic politics. And so I'll talk in a minute about an example of that. It also involves looking at our role as ordinary people as the main financiers of the capitalist system, you and I. And so this involves tax resistance, to stop acting as the financiers of capitalism in a capitalist state, and divestment and redirection of our investments into non-capitalist enterprises, and also ideological work that involves demystification, media work, and moving beyond the false consciousness that this is the only way to behave. And then there are creative constructive actions that involve building the solidarity economy, as it's called, solving the housing problem, the food problem, developing, which are necessary for survival, developing cooperative economic activities to meet other needs and wants, to solve the personal transportation problem, to enact what's been termed mutual aid, and to take part in very limited electoral work to achieve dual power. So building the solidarity economy outside capitalism, I just want to talk very briefly about two little examples of this among many. Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi and this group in Illinois that I've been involved with. But there are actually at least 170 organizations in the United States that are trying to achieve the solidarity economy outside capitalism, and thousands, it turns out, worldwide. So Jackson, I'm not sure. Are people familiar with Jackson? Jackson, Mississippi?
Yeah.
This is some of you are. So just very briefly, this is Jackson Rising, and this is Chokwe Lumumba, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who died a few years ago under unclear circumstances. And this involves building the solidarity economy. It has roots in Afro-American organizations in the South, principles of nationalism, anti-capitalist struggle, popular power by activists like Malcolm X and Chokwe Lumumba. I could say more about the history. I highly recommend this book to you, which describes the history. It's really an amazing struggle. And this focuses actually on building the solidarity economy in one of the most vulnerable places in the world, Jackson, Mississippi. And it involves focusing on housing, food independence, and environmental sustainability. Then I just wanted to say a few more words about the group in Illinois and Wisconsin, which is called the Horizontal State Line Autonomous Region. And so this is one of the logos, which is actually from Chiapas, the World Festival of Resistance and Rebellion Against Capitalism. So this is based on anarcho-socialist principles that achieve democratic and communal self-government without a state apparatus. And this is the creation of Bradley and others. I have very little to do with it. Influenced, though, by the Zapatista Revolution and Chiapas, where multiple people in this group of basically people you don't expect to be doing this, like community college students and workers in precarious jobs, not the usual suspects. I've gone to Chiapas and actually worked with the Zapatistas to try to understand the way to build a solidarity economy within the United States. And this is the sign in Chiapas. Here you are in Zapatista territory in rebellion. Here the people rule and the government obeys. And what we're seeing now actually in Mexico is the dialectic between this model, the model I talked about earlier of Lopez Obrador and the nationally elected progressive government that is actually going to change things in that way. So this is like a momentous world-scale struggle that's going to be happening in Mexico over the next 6 years. And I highly recommend trying to understand that and to, in various ways, get involved in supporting it. And so this is the same saying that I mentioned earlier, and these are some photos from the group. So these are seedlings leading to community gardens that are actually quite extensive now, after only a year and a half. Enough to feed people for a lot of the time to reduce the dependency on capitalist food production. This is a photo of the group, and this is a discussion of how to acquire housing at very low prices to provide very cheap housing to liberate people from the two main ways that people aren't liberated economically: food and housing. And so this is the Facebook page of the group in Illinois and Wisconsin. So to conclude, the death of capitalism and the birth of something different. So the rinky-dink revolution is simple, safe, available to anyone who has the gumption to change her or his life a little bit. We can realize the joy of stopping our consent and unwilling support of a system that we know destroys our own health, well-being, and happiness, as well as the earth. The surprise will come when we see that the revolution doesn't have to involve injury, death, or even much discomfort. It mainly has to do with ending our collaboration with it. And it mainly requires that we stop doing many things that we hate doing anyway. And so, obviously, this is a collective work in progress. I sincerely would welcome your suggestions either now or in other times. And also you're considering ways that you all can help us all move beyond capitalism for our health. Thank you.
So I'd like to also emphasize the co-sponsor of this talk is the National Nurses United, California Nurses Association, which has been a wonderful partner for us during a couple of years between the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. Now, my recommendation is, we have very limited time, why don't you, if you want some constructive suggestions, why don't we get a number of very short interventions and then kind of pull them together? Well, that's,
Someone turn on the front lights again.
yeah, so why don't we pull those together and then you can give a response to maybe a number of them? Would that work for you?
Why
So,
don't you coordinate?
sorry?
Why don't you
Okay, so
MC
I,
that?
so again, please, wonderful, succinct, powerful, short interventions, and we'll collect as many as we can and then give the floor back to Howard Waitzkin. Yes.
When I was a student here 52 years ago, I was so enthralled with the concept of going into medicine, which I did. But as I have, I'm sorry, but over an extended period of time, I've come to realize how very destructive a lot of medicine as we purvey it can be. How 30% of medical services rendered are totally superfluous or unnecessary. How people, and particularly in these biopharmaceutical companies and these biomedical companies, are exercising treatment methodologies which are injurious to people. And to me, I think if we could educate the public better as to how to recognize what beneficial medical services are and what beneficial services are not, we'd be taking a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
Would you mind, if you feel okay about it, just identifying yourself and name and where you are?
Hi, my name is Christy, and the reason why I'm here, the reason why I'm here is I am a person who's been physically and mentally just beaten down by capitalism. And in fact, I'm so beat down that even though I feel like I'm in an audience where people are going to listen to what I have to say, I still feel the nervousness that I've been conditioned with, having lived in the system. So, but now I feel like within me, I'm empowered with the knowledge from trying to self-study neurocognition. So I'm going to try, and I realize I want to be respectful to people who want to leave. So I won't feel offended if or if you want to cut me off or something like that. But I feel like I could, the knowledge that I've acquired through, it's been so hard, through neurocognition, could not only just complement what you've said, not only from my personal experience, but also to act as an intellectual catalyst to accelerate the death of capitalism and also bring about one that is what I would call socially engineered by feminine cognition, because I feel like that is the root cause of this capitalism. It was designed by masculine brains, and in particular Anglo-Saxon. And if we can recognize that, we can come up with a paradigm-shifting economic system that would be beneficial to both genders, and not only genders, but also races as well, because I lived in South Africa for 4 years, and I've noticed that the colonialism, even though it's actually come to an end in South Africa, cognitive colonialism is still apparent there, because the people who are black, they starting out to think like white people, and they call them coconuts, because they said, I can't identify with anymore because you don't think like me. So even though the companies boast of diversity, they all think alike, so there's lack of cognitive diversity. Anyway, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I'll take a couple more short interventions here. Well, I might recognize myself there. If you were to go back to that model, I would like to wonder if we have capitalism alone up here, which seems to be producing things like ill health, the carceral state. I have a question for you. Is it only one capitalism, right? Or is it we're actually focusing on capitalisms? And is capitalism these days still distinct from things like pharmaceuticals, where now the most profitable industry for capitalism is the production of pharmaceuticals, and the pharmaceuticalization of capitalism has actually transformed capitalism. So are we actually talking about multiple capitalisms in relationship to the sort of symbiotic co-production with the forms of the carceral state, the endless war? Are these things distinct anymore? So that would be my question. Mauricio?
My name is Mauricio. I'm a student here at Berkeley. I had a question about secularism and about sort of the idea that the way that people hold capitalism doesn't seem to be very secular. It's held as a deeply held religious belief with a series of religious practices and ways of making meaning and being in the world and making value. And if we see it as a problem of insufficient rationality, if we have to convince people, that seems like a very different approach than saying we're actually asking them to change their religious beliefs and practices, and whether or not that makes any difference for your analysis on what to do.
What do you think? Should we take one or more quick interventions and then give the floor back to you? All right. The word from above says no, that we hand this back, the mic, literally, back to Howard to be able to sort of respond in any way you might like to these questions and comments.
Okay, so I guess I wanted to respond to a couple of the points, and I'm not going to do justice to a couple of the questions just because they're actually pretty complicated and will take time. As far as the last point, as far as the last point of the religious aspect, so I think it's a very important insight, because what is presented as economic science is actually a set of belief. It's a belief system based on faith. And just as an example of that, for decades now, I've been assigning in classes on health policy and sociology and so on, the assignment to come up with one research article that shows that markets in healthcare are beneficial, which is the teaching in medical economics, that it's markets. And that I'd offer extra credit for that. And so what we have is this, this model that masquerades as a science that actually is a faith-based set of dictates. And this is actually one of the things that we're up against in terms of mystification and demystification, because and the idea that there is no alternative, because there clearly is an alternative, and the notions about the need for private-based markets are actually faith-based rather than scientific noise. So, brief response there. To the other questions, I was very moved by the comments that you were making in terms of gender and so forth. And clearly the model here has to be rethought on many levels. But the key thing that the point that I want to make is to the importance of uniting this from the standpoint of a single vision about how exploitation occurs and how a post-exploitative system will evolve. These structures having to do with gender, racism certainly, and so forth, are very important parts of why we have the problems that we do. And we need actually to take a multifaceted view of where to go from here. And I guess I wanted to just address Charles' point about capitalisms. So I actually really disagree with you, because there are different formats of this, but the underlying structure of capitalism actually remains, in my opinion, pretty much as Marx and Engels described it, which has to do with surplus value. And this is what I was referring to earlier in the talk. The fundamental basis of exploitation being the value that's generated by the labor of us as workers that's then enjoyed as surplus value by a class, a very small class of people who actually aren't doing the work but enjoying the benefits of the work. And that's the essence of exploitation. And so it actually, I think we need to be clear. There are variations on that theme, but that, in my opinion, is the key contradiction that needs to be addressed. And what is okay to continue in terms of the nature of our Reykjavik revolution, and what is not okay to continue has to do with the exploitative or non-exploitative characteristics of surplus value in that division of capitalism. So that would be a brief response.
Well, we'll continue our debate later. 3 final words of thank you. Chris Nielsen here from National Nurses United, California Nurses Association, our partner in this. Thank you so much. Interesting, the power here that's directing this event, who has really made the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, I'm sure that Seth Holmes, co-director, would agree, possible, and particularly this visit. But most of all, thanks a lot to Howard Waitzkin.